I don't know, Charmander, maybe it was the Minish. Well, I was joking, but maybe the Minish could be returning in the sequel to The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. Welcome everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time we're talking about how perhaps the Minish from The Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap, could be returning in the sequel to The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. Now, why do I think this is possible? Well, there's quite a few reasons, but first let's talk about who the Minish are. Now, these are smaller people that were introduced in The Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap. These characters were apparently inspired by the Korapuk Guru, who were a smaller people in Japanese folklore who preferred to live under leaves and also enjoyed being hidden from others. But another potential inspiration for the Minish were the brownies from British folklore, or the elves from The Elves and the Shoemaker. The Elves and the Shoemaker is a common tale where you have smaller elves helping to build shoes for the shoemaker while he's asleep. Well, there's actually a quest in the Minish Cap where you have the Minish building the Pegasus boots in place of the shoemaker in the game. In my opinion, there's a very strong inspiration here, and I think this is actually very telling for what we can maybe see in Breath of the Wild 2, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But first, let's talk about how there was actually already some ideas or concepts to bring something like the Minish in the original Breath of the Wild. So after Breath of the Wild came out, Nintendo released a 3-part series called The Making of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And in the second part, story and characters, they started talking about the smaller people that were at one point planned for the game. This is what Hidemaro Fujibayashi had to say. "We did have times when we had ideas for certain characters, but decided not to use them once we got further into development. For example, we had this idea of including tiny people. Since this is a 3D game, we could have all these tiny sized towns and Link himself could shrink. We thought it'd be super fun if we had all these tiny characters all over the place. But with all these other characters that stand out, we thought it would be difficult for these little guys to be able to live out their own place in the game. So we really wanted to have them in there for the gameplay, but sadly had to give up on the idea." So as you can see with the concept art, they had these smaller people that were planned for Breath of the Wild that greatly resembled the Minish. They even had the idea to have Link shrink down, just like in the Minish Cap. Effectively, these were going to be another type of Minish people in Breath of the Wild, but they didn't make it into the final cut of the game. However, I would argue that Breath of the Wild 2, its entire foundation is based upon ideas that didn't make it into the original Breath of the Wild. Here's a quote from Onuma for an interview with Kotaku. "When we released the DLC for Breath of the Wild, we realized that this is a great way to add more elements to the same world. But when it comes down to technical things, DLC is pretty much data. You are adding data to a pre-existing title. And so when we wanted to add bigger changes, DLC is not enough, and that's why we thought maybe a sequel would be a good fit." So here Onuma is explaining that they had so many different ideas for the DLC in Breath of the Wild that they decided that it made more sense to just put this all into a whole new game, or use a lot of these different ideas to make a whole new game, which now we know is going to be the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Now, to be fully fair, this quote is talking about DLC, ideas that came out after the Breath of the Wild. These Minish people were cut content for the original base game. But who's to say that they weren't at least considering reintroducing the Minish into the DLC for Breath of the Wild? They had so many different ideas, and at one point they really did want to bring in the Minish into Breath of the Wild, but they didn't quite make the cut. What if in Breath of the Wild 2, it makes more sense from a gameplay perspective to bring them into the game? So what I'm getting at here is that in the sequel, there are going to be differences from the original game. There are going to be things about the game that will make it different. Even though it's going to be in Hyrule, there's going to be a lot of changes. Now, one common idea is that there's going to be a lot of reconstruction to all the ruins in Breath of the Wild. After all, at the end of the original Breath of the Wild, both Link and Zelda set out to restore Hyrule and perhaps rebuild all the ruins that are there. So what if there are a lot of different quests in Breath of the Wild 2 that are all about rebuilding ruins and towns? The most popular side quest in Breath of the Wild is the Tarrey Town quest, where you do a whole bunch of different things to help build up a whole town called Tarrey Town. And given that Breath of the Wild 2 is a sequel, kind of like a Majora's Mask situation, maybe we could be seeing a lot more interesting quests in the game, just like how Majora's Mask had a lot more interesting side quests compared to Ocarina of Time. and maybe they'll take some ideas from the greatly loved Tarrytown quest and bring in a lot more town building quests in Breath of the Wild 2. If that's the case, if there's a big emphasis on restoring Hyrule back to its former glory by rebuilding a lot of the ruins, maybe that could then open up an opportunity for the Minish to make sense to be added in the game. So this brings us back to what I was talking about early on with the inspirations for the Minish. One of the inspirations for the Minish were the elves and the shoemaker. They helped to build shoes. The Minish are a kind of people that could definitely play a role, in my opinion, in helping to build things and restore things, perhaps the different ruins in Breath of the Wild 2. So considering their fit, considering their inspiration, considering that there is a strong demand to have them at one point, and there's a lot of different DLC ideas that are going into Breath of the Wild 2, I think there's a pretty good chance that perhaps the Minish could be making a grand return in Breath of the Wild 2. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think the Minish could be making their grand return in the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild? Or maybe this is just an idea that was canned for Breath of the Wild and they won't be making a return, but there will be a whole bunch of other really interesting ideas that we'll see play out in the sequel. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Anyways everyone, this is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.